To Bitcoin for Peace. I have somebody here with me who wrote a book that I'm giving it to everybody. I want everybody to read The Hidden Cost of Money. He's the CEO and co-founder of Looking Glass Education. This is Seb Bunney. What's up, Seb? Welcome.
Hey Valerie, honestly, it is 100% my pleasure to be able to sit down and chat with you. As I mentioned in my little tweet yesterday, I think you're one of the most enthusiastic, jazzed people in the Bitcoin space, and so I feel honored to sit down here.
Thanks. Yeah, it's like you give me the wind beneath my wings to be enthusiastic because it's people like you who are out there educating the world, gathering information, assembling it in a way that's digestible for those of us who aren't hedge fund managers and cryptographers. So I really, really appreciate what you're doing out there, Seb. So do you want to talk about, it's for the audience, let them know who you are and what's your backstory so we can kind of get an idea of who is Seb, and then we're going to dive into the book and broken families and how Bitcoin can possibly be a tool.
Absolutely, yeah. So, man, it's so tough to know where to start. But I would say if I go all the way back to the start, and when I say the start, I mean like the start. I would say I started when I look in hindsight, realizing that money impacted us and me as an individual from very early on. My
Yeah.
parents separated when I was about 5 years old, and
Mm-hmm.
that meant that my mum had to look after my two brothers and I. And when I look in hindsight, I start to recognize that because of the monetary pressures that my mum faced, she maybe wasn't able to meet the emotional needs of my two brothers and I to the same extent she might want to be able to. And so this is that first sign when I started to look back on my childhood that money starts to play a role in how we show up as individuals. And then secondly, I would say my passion from about 8, 9 years old has been mountain biking. It was my first true love. I was completely obsessed with mountain biking, and I wanted to teach mountain biking, coach mountain biking. I wanted to move to Canada and start to become a mountain bike guide. And when I started to do that in my teens, all of a sudden I'm interacting with these professional athletes that are on the world stage, the Tiger Woods of the mountain bike world. And I'm realizing that these people are up to their neck in debt. They're struggling to survive.
Yeah.
They don't know many times where their next meal is going to come from. And so this made me start to realize, if I want to be able to get ahead in life, I have to have some forms of passive income. I need to start investing. I've got to look at money differently. And so those are kind of just two little examples, but there's been many throughout my life. And I'm sure listeners are probably have got very similar stories. But money it shapes how we show up in the world. And so I
Yeah.
started to question, how can I live my best life? And that led me down this rabbit hole that eventually led me to Bitcoin. I started to realize that actually, if we want to lead our best life, we need to change the monetary system so that it actually supports us in looking inwards and asking the questions, how do I want to show up? Who am I? Like, what motivates me and what drives me, and how do I want to contribute to society? And that's where ultimately I believe Bitcoin brings us back to ourselves. And that's, I think, incredible.
It is. And it's such an interesting, you and I shared a similar past with the divorce and the single mom and just not having them around as much, like the way that, the family unit gets constructed because of money is huge. I think in your book you had mentioned only seven, and I want to make sure I have this number right, only 7% of families have the ability to have a stay-at-home parent, and that 93% have you have to have two earner incomes. Did I read that? Listen to that right? I'm listening on Audible, so I
Yeah,
sometimes.
I don't have. I don't have the stat right in front of me, but in Canada, we have seen since 1970. So since the US dollar basically departed from the gold standard and fiat currencies are kind of taken over, we have seen a halving of single earner households and a
Yeah,
doubling of dual earner households. So what that's showing is that the cost of living crisis is making it harder and harder for families to get ahead. So much so that both parents are having to go out and work. And if both parents are having to work, what does that mean? Well, that means kids are spending more time with their peers as opposed to their
yep,
parents. Now, some may think that's great, and to a certain extent it is. I think socialization is amazing. But the reality is that if we look back throughout history, all the way back to our ancestors, our tribal roots, family is so important. Elders are so important because it is our elders, it is our parents that help us with our moral compass. It's our
yeah,
parents that allow us to be able to understand how to live off the land and learn skills to be able to survive. Whereas peers, unfortunately, when we are 10, 12, 13 years old and we're just interacting with our peers instead of our elders and our parents, Well, peer relationships are a lot more superficial. We want to look the same, we want to sound the same. And so we're having a culture crisis right now. We're having a culture crisis because people are spending less time with elders and parents. They're spending more time with their peers. And that also explains sometimes why we're having higher rates of nihilism, depression, anxiety, because people don't know how to fit in, because they're lacking that authenticity, because they don't know who they are, because they don't have that grounding rock. They're not spending time in those tight-knit communities that we once were.
Well, and I think about you're probably know Dr. Gabor Mate, right? And I think he wrote a book called "Hold On to Your Kids," and it was about that age group too. About because it really is when the children are starting to differentiate themselves in the teen years, they do need to be able to start that normal developmental process. However, if we don't have something for them to come home to that is stable and grounded, and that kind of, I think about it as like the side of the pool, you get to hold on, and then it's like, okay, go out and swim for a little while, but home and your parents and the adults is like your safe area where you can be yourself and you can be received and accepted. And if there's nobody home after school, that's what I went through. You end up spending all this time with your peers who might be also not having parents at home, who might be doing drugs and alcohol and having sex at early ages and just being kids, and getting
Yeah,
into trouble. And so it never really occurred to me that this financial system could be contributing to this because of the inflation and because we don't have the same purchasing power. Year after year after year, we're getting stolen from through inflation. People have to work longer hours. They're not around. They're exhausted when they get home, and so when they are with their families, they're not giving them the best that they have. And a lot of times they're checking out with alcohol, with, anything that just can numb the overwhelm. And so that authentic, loving, safe connection that you want to have with your children isn't available as much, because of this broken system.
absolutely. Absolutely. And what's fascinating is that evolutionarily, we have an adaptation to attach. Because naturally, when we're young, when we're a few months old, a few years old, we cannot survive without attachment. We need to attach to our mother, we need to attach to our father, so they're able to feed us and support us. But the
Mhm.
problem is that's now the role of the mother and the father as well, to be able to support you in individuation. And you need to be able to individuate to be able to find out, well, who am I and how do I want to show up in this world? And the
Right.
problem is when we are looking to our peers and we're trying to look the same and sound the same and have the same mannerisms and wear the same clothes, the challenge is we're not individuating. And what we're
Right.
seeing in society is we're seeing a lot of these mimicking cultures where people are simply trying to fit in, but they're not actually thinking for themselves. And that's impacting society. And it's also leading to the rising rates of meaninglessness that we're seeing, because people, although they may have community, they don't know who they are. And I think that's really, really important, is we need to find out who we are as individuals. And a strong foundational support is the parent. The parent should allow the kids to be able to allow themselves to identify who they are.
Yeah, I think that's super important. I remember I was at a Tony Robbins event after my divorce, and I was going through all these, life changes and what's going on. And um, he was talking about just the need for humans to be consistent with their identity and how important that is for each one of us. And so if we don't even have an idea of our identity because we're over here velcroing on to other people's things because that's socially acceptable and you want to quote unquote fit in because it's a survival instinct. And if you're out there in the jungle and you don't have that safe home, you're going to start your identity is going to get shifted into something that's not you, authentically you. And so obviously social media is contributing to this. I have two teenagers that I'm constantly, you know trying to engage with conversations about, well, what do you think about that, and what's not what are your friends doing. And so it's not as easy as we want it to be. And because social media is so prevalent, it's 24/7. It's not just like, okay, back, when I was in school, you go to school and you come home and you cruise around. But now it's 24/7. You're getting influence, you're getting, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement through these channels. And so it's like if you post something and you get shot down by your peers, I mean, mentally, these kids are not capable yet of navigating that,
Mhm.
that overwhelm. And so, what are you seeing in your work with, um, in your educational work with people, and how are they, like, what kind of coping skills are we needing to get stronger with for our young people and for ourselves, for individuation, and not just
Mhm.
getting into groupthink and getting into that mode.
Well, and it's really, really challenging because I think that what can be sometimes hard to understand is how money actually impacts our behavior and how we are
Yeah.
showing up as individuals. And
Mhm.
there's certain that the challenge is, as individuals, there's certain incentives that are going to push certain behaviors. And in order for us to actually change how people are showing up in society, we can't just tell them to change. We have to actually realign the incentives. And that's the
Yeah.
thing that's really challenging. And so in the book, I discuss kind of 3 areas about how money impacts how we show up. And I'll mention them now because I think that's really important. And then that will
Okay.
kind of hopefully start to answer your question, which is the first one is in the world of Bitcoin, people talk a lot about time preference. Time preference being,
Mhm.
do I have a low time preference? Am I thinking about the future of building security, building safety because I want to have prosperity for myself and my family? Or do I have a high time preference, which is, am I thinking about just meeting my impulsive needs right now? And the challenge is when money is worth less over time, like we have in the fiat world, is that we're
Mhm.
actually incentivized to be impulsive, given that our purchasing power is greatest in this present moment. So
Yeah.
people are consuming, they're buying whatever they can. And this is leading to this very consumerist society. But what it's also leading to is because we're buying whatever we can, the coolest car, the new shoes, whatever, we've also got a society where sometimes we think that happiness is this external thing. If I get the newest thing, then I'm going to be happy. But
Yeah.
happiness is very much an internal thing. It is, do I feel worthy? Am I challenging myself? Do I have community? Am I collaborating with others? That is where we derive happiness from. It is not from the newest car or the newest sunglasses or whatever. And I think that's so important for people to step back and recognize that our society is incentivizing certain behaviors. It's
Yeah.
incentivizing us to think short term and impulsively. Bitcoin, on the other hand, flips that. It flips
Yeah.
it because our purchasing power increases over time. All of a sudden, we're incentivized to save. If we're incentivized to save, we start thinking about, if I store this money, then maybe I'm able to maybe upgrade my house to be able to support my kids and my family. Or what does the future look like if I'm able to purchase this thing that can help me thrive a little more in my community? And so that long-term thinking starts to build prosperity. So it's actually
Mhm.
changing our thinking. And then the next point is meaninglessness. And the challenge is because our money is worth less over time, people are increasingly either consuming or they're flooding into assets. So asset prices are skyrocketing, the cost of living is skyrocketing, and it makes it very hard for people to plan. It makes it very hard for people to think about the future and start saving because they don't actually know what is the world going to look like in 6 months' time? What is the world going to look like in a year's time? And so it's very hard if we cannot plan, if we don't know what the future looks like, meaninglessness can quickly set in. And we see this in society. We've got the highest rates of nihilism, depression, suicide, drug use because people just don't know what to do. They don't know what other options there are. Bitcoin, on the other hand, it fixes this. It flips it on its head again. Because our purchasing power increases into the future and our cost of living falls, we can
Yeah.
start planning. And if we can start planning, we can start giving back to society. We can start thinking about how I want to support my family. So instead of meaninglessness, we start to have meaning. And that is huge. That starts helping us on like a deeper, more like intrinsic level. And then the final one, which I'll just quickly mention, is kind of compassion and altruism.
Yeah.
And in psychology, one of my passions is I was studying to become a somatic therapist for a long time. And childhood development and psychology have always been kind of front of mind for me. And so
Mhm.
in psychology, there's something called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it's a
Mhm.
5 tier pyramid, and a lot of people have probably heard of it. And at the base of that pyramid, the first tier is your basic survival needs. You need food and shelter. And then above that, you start getting into relationships and you start getting all the way to the top at self actualization. But the reality is that we cannot think about self actualization, spiritual growth, emotional growth, relationships if we're not even able to eat and we're not able to put a roof over our heads. And so when it comes to our current monetary system, because life is getting so hard, people are stuck on this bottom rung. They're not
Yeah.
able to think about compassion and altruism and giving back and contributing to society because they're just trying to get what they can out of society to survive. Bitcoin, again, flips all of this on its head. And so, what I think is so profound about Bitcoin is that ultimately, it doesn't change us by saying you should do this and you should do this. What it does is it actually changes the incentives of society to incentivize us to think long term, to incentivize us to look inwards, to incentivize us to ask these kind of deeper, meaningful questions about who am I and how do I want to show up? And that's where I think ultimately, and you and I were chatting before we went on, what is so fascinating and ironic about Bitcoin is that it's money that allows us to actually stop thinking about money. And I think that is so cool.
Yeah, and who would have thought, right, that that's going to be the solution? Like I know you and I share a lot of similarities with personal growth and practices and whatnot. And again, I was mentioning like I thought, what if we could all just meditate and everything would be great, or everybody dropped acid, or went to a rave or Woodstock, and here we go, kumbaya. And I think of like, what would John Lennon or Dr. King have done, or Gandhi, with Bitcoin? How would they have, if they had Nostra and Bitcoin, or if they had any kind of internet and social media, like how would the world have been a different place? Do you think that they would have wrapped into a broader solution? Because I mean, clearly the movement of change and the movement of civil rights and human rights and caring for the earth exists, but a lot of these people didn't understand. I mean, we're on a gold standard obviously back then, but what do you think they would have done if they had Bitcoin? Like, what
Well,
do you think
and
John Lennon would do?
absolutely. What's interesting is that there's no matter the situation, you're always going to get people that can go against the grain and push against the natural incentives of society. So even if we're going through hard times, you're always going to get those people that rise up and speak their voice no matter what. And those people are how we have pivoted history and society. And I think it's so inspiring. But the reality is that for the average person, we're a product of our environment. And because of that, if we want to create mass change and we want to trend society towards prosperity, we have to change the incentives. So we incentivize such behavior. And our current system doesn't do that. And what I think is really important, and I discuss this in the book, is that the way I tend to look at money is like language. It's a medium of expression. It's how we express to the world what it is that we value. Now, what do I mean by that? If you go into a grocery store and you see someone buying grass-fed beef and organic vegetables, and then you see someone buying microwave meals and cigarettes, you can see what each person values just by what it is that they're purchasing. They're expressing to the world what it is that they value. And so in a true free market society, where money flows in society is basically highlighting what society values. It highlights what sectors of the economy are offering value to society. But the challenge is also, like language, money can be censored. And so when we face capital controls, like in China, where China basically massively impedes Chinese citizens from moving capital abroad because it wants to be able to devalue the currency to fund operations, what that does is stops Chinese citizens from trying to think about their family and trying to protect themselves by keeping that capital inside the border. Or when we think about inflation, when the government is printing more currency units and funding operations at our expense, it's taking our purchasing power and spending our purchasing power where they see fit, not where we would naturally express ourselves. And the analogy I like to give is, me as an individual, I may not support war. I never want to be able to direct capital towards war. But if the government can devalue the currency and spend that money on war, it doesn't actually matter what I care about, because my money, my purchasing power, is being shown to be expressed as supporting war. And so the challenge we face in society today is many of us are being impeded in our ability to express ourselves monetarily because our purchasing power is depleting, and the government is spending our purchasing power where they see fit and not where we see fit. And ultimately, what I think is so profound about Bitcoin is that it allows us to express ourselves monetarily without censorship. It's the ultimate form of free speech, because we can direct capital to where we see fit. So if we support something or something offers value in society, it's not someone else's decision to decide on what I value. I want to be able to direct capital where I see fit. And that's what I think is so profound about Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think it's super important. And, Alex Gladstein was just on with me about an hour ago. And, we were talking about obviously how fiat can fund forever wars, and that they used to have war bonds and taxes to support the wars. But now, after we went off the gold standard, they just print money. And it's the same as taxation, but it's even with less consent. And it looks like we're just doing this old, manipulation over here with the interest rates and lending and all that stuff. But the truth is we're getting stolen from. And then that money is getting expressed in ways that we wouldn't have, agreed to as, individual citizens. So it's their sly roundabout way of taking our energy, our life force, and removing it from our lives. And so I think, so many people, possibly listening in the world, we don't understand the connection between why is fiat causing so much damage in the family units, in the communities, in the governments, in businesses, among states, among countries. And so can you help people who may not understand like the fiat system versus Bitcoin, and why like printing forever and ever and ever is different than having the scarce, the distribution supply like Bitcoin?
For sure. And you know what? Bring it back to, well, actually, I should say that there is so many phenomenal resources out there. But the reason why I wrote The Hidden Cost of Money was because I recognized that, man, if you want to dive into Bitcoin and corporations, awesome. Well, Saylor has got some incredible resources. If you want to dive into the philosophical approach, you can dive into Breedlove. Antonopoulos gives a deep dive into the technical aspects. But I didn't feel that there was enough content out there that explored how does money actually just impact us on a social level? Because I
Yeah.
think that ultimately all of us are impacted by money, and we may not quite understand how money weaves its influence into our relationships and our behavior, as I just explained, or parenting. And so sometimes when we bring it back to the social level, I think that's when it really, really hits home. And so when we think about money today and money in its current form, the reality is that money is the number one stressor globally. It's something like 76% of people globally face monetary stress. That's
Yeah.
huge. And because
Huge.
it's number one monetary stressor and we're all facing that stress, well, how does that impact us as individuals? Well, first off, as I explained, like if we're parents and we want to be able to put a roof over our kids' heads and to be able to feed them and support them and nurture them, if all of a sudden we're being stressed financially and we're spending more time at work, we may not be able to meet our kids' emotional needs to the point to the level at which we would like to. And this
Yeah.
leads to emotional developmental issues, you name it. Kids maybe not feeling the same love, leads to trauma later in life. So
Yeah.
that's one way that it's starting to impact them. But not only that, it even impacts the kids while the kid from basic conception, while the kid is still inside its mum's tummy, it's already starting to impact the kid. So how does it do that? Basically, if we know that money is the number one form of stress, then if a mum is starting to feel stressed while they are pregnant, then they're going to start to release stress hormones like cortisol and epinephrine and adrenaline. Now, what's interesting about that is those stress hormones start to impact the development of the baby. And what ends up happening is that their nervous system, their immune system, basically becomes heightened. So when they are born, they already have a hyperactive, hypersensitive immune system. So it's really easy for them to become stuck in fight, flight, freeze, a lot of these natural evolutionary adaptations. Now, what's
Hmm.
interesting is let's just take one of those. Let's look at freeze. A lot of people globally, if you're listening to this and you've explored trauma, you'll realize a lot of us are stuck in what's called functional freeze. Well, what is freeze? Freeze naturally, if from our when we used to live on the plains of Africa, if a lion were to come upon us and we realized we couldn't run away, all of a sudden our nervous system is going to shut down and our breathing rate is going to slow, our digestion is going to stop. And the whole goal is to try and force us to pause in the hopes that the lion isn't going to see us and the lion is going to walk away. But when we're stuck in a state of freeze day to day, we still have slow breathing rate. We have slow blood flow, slow nutrient absorption. So now day to day, that's impacting our sleep. We could be eating all really, really good quality foods, organic foods, but we're not absorbing any of the nutrients from it. And so people are wondering why they've got autoimmune and health issues. And it's because they're stuck in a functional freeze. And so
Interesting.
many people these days, from the moment we're born, before we're even entering this world, money and monetary stress on our mum is starting to impact our needs and our development, which is huge. So I think it's really important to recognize that our money plays a huge role on who we are. And the challenge is kind of to answer your question is how does our current monetary system differ to Bitcoin? And the reality is that when we think about society, humans are always striving to get more for less. And this is a Jeff Booth thesis. So you should read The Price of Tomorrow if you find this stuff interesting. But humans
Where
are
is it?
always striving to get more for
Up
less.
there.
It's up there somewhere.
It's up behind the logo.
And so what that means is like ever since we've been cavemen, those who have been able to survive are those that have been able to take the natural environment and the tools and to be able to increase their productivity and increase their efficiency. So as time goes on, life should be getting easier. If you think about it, like our ability to harvest an apple 200 years ago to today is far, far, far simpler. Yet the cost of apples have gone up. So why has the cost of apples gone up if our ability to harvest them has got easier and easier and easier? And it's
Right.
because our monetary system, unfortunately, is printing more money at a quicker pace than our productivity and efficiency is increasing, which
Yeah.
means that life is getting harder, even though it should be getting easier. If we have money like Bitcoin, it flips it on its head. When you have a fixed supply of currency units, as productivity increases, as technological advancement advances, what we start to see is our cost of living declines. Things start falling in relation to Bitcoin. So if our cost of living is declining and houses are becoming easier to purchase and food is becoming cheaper, all of a sudden our capacity to show up how we want to as individuals is just far easier. And so that's where I truly believe, as I mentioned at the start, on a more spiritual level, I think Bitcoin brings us back to ourselves. And that is
Yeah.
just huge. And that's kind of taking it out of the technical economic side of things and bringing it back to more of the social layer.
Well, I think that's, again, this is obviously Bitcoin for peace. And I do believe that Bitcoin is one of the many tools we have to create a more peaceful individual self, a more peaceful family, communities, planet, and everything. And, part of that is having that feeling of safety and security. And, it's interesting that you mentioned, being in the womb and getting your mother's cortisol and starting as you're already developing that you're just operating naturally in that trauma response mode. So coping mechanisms, to navigate trauma, if you don't even know you're in it, sometimes you're just doing things to check out, to numb, to just get rid of that feeling of overwhelm. To me, I think of trauma, certain trauma responses are like having your foot on the gas and the brakes at the same time, and you're trying to slow down, but you're trying to get away, and you're doing both, and your system is just like, ah. I had an interesting experience. I'm just going to do a quick segue here, but when I was a baby in my mom's belly, I didn't know this till I was 25 years old, and so this is a testament to what you were just saying. For 25 years of my life, I thought, my parents were married, la la la. They ended up getting divorced. When I was, a young 10, 11-year old girl, but for some reason, I carried with me this whole like fear of abandonment and this weird vibe that was going on. And I just couldn't place it because I was like, well, my parents didn't abandon me. They just got a divorce. So I was doing holistic healing and wellness in San Diego and working at a chiropractor's office. And I was just asking him, like, I can't seem to shake this. I don't know what's going on. And he started doing muscle testing with me. Are you familiar with muscle testing? And so for those of you who don't know muscle testing, it's like there's, we're energy circuits. And so um, the chiropractor was moving my arm and touching all these different acupoints on me. And he was like, when was the first time you felt this fear of abandonment? And was it when you were 25, 20, da, 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 da. And my arm wasn't collapsing, and it wasn't until I was 6 months in the womb, in my mother's womb, that my arm collapsed. And I just kind of looked at him like, okay, snake oil salesman. I just totally thought this guy was full of nonsense, right? And he asked me if my mom was still alive and that I should go ask her what was going on when I was, 6 months in her womb. And so, of course, she finally I called her up and I was like, "What's up, Mom? I had this whole thing." She goes, "Well, I guess you're old enough to know now."
Did you have a
And I'm
twin?
like, say it again.
Did you have a twin?
No, I didn't have a twin, but she goes, "You're old enough to know now." And I'm like, "Old enough to know what?" Um, Apparently, she was pregnant with with me and was having an affair with my dad. And he didn't, leave the woman that he was with. And he kept saying, "I'm going to marry you and be with you." And she's freaking out because this is the late 60s and she's a single mom already with my brother. And now she's pregnant with me and she's having absolute terror and fear about being abandoned by this man who's the father of her child and her boss, by the way, too, because she was the secretary and he was the boss and the whole thing. And so it was just this like, you mean everything that I've been, dealing with is yours, Mom? And so just for anybody listening, it's just especially women who want to get pregnant and have babies, like it's so important to understand that you're literally baking a human, and everything you do and think and feel and these emotions and these chemicals are forming this person. And so just like you said, like if parents and families, especially moms, are experiencing that level of stress, the baby is going to absorb all of that, and it's going to get sculpted with those stress hormones and whatnot. So I just find it fascinating that, like, so I just wanted to validate what you're saying, Seb, because it's real. Like, what happens in the womb it carries out through the rest of our lives as individuals, and so I'm hoping that this money system, this thing called Bitcoin, can help so that we don't have so much trauma that we have to play cleanup with throughout our whole lives, and learn new coping mechanisms, and not have to deal with suicide and depression and anxiety because of something that, is going on with math.
Well, and honestly, like, Valeria, I hugely appreciate you sharing that, because I know that, like, that's heavy, and you start to realize that actually maybe a lot of the thoughts or the beliefs that we carry are many times not our own thoughts and beliefs.
Totally.
And I think that what people sometimes struggle to understand is, just because we don't have a memory of something, that doesn't mean it hasn't impacted us. And there's a lot of studies that dive into the difference between implicit versus explicit memories. And so implicit, meaning that they're implied. We don't remember them. We don't have a specific memory of this event, but it can still impact us. And
Totally.
explicit is in we do remember what that thing is. And I'll give you an example. Like, I have one of my best friends, Helen. She has a twin. And this is why it came up, as you were saying, that this fear of abandonment. And she had always felt this kind of resentment, as if her twin had abandoned her. And so whenever they spend time together, she always just feels this like discomfort. And she went and saw this lady a little while back, and the little lady and this lady was asking her questions about her twin. And she realized that the twin was born 10 minutes before her, and the twin left her in the womb. And this, it all stems from, and so she doesn't have a memory of this, but it's an implicit belief. It's a belief that is formed in those very early developmental years. And we know that it's something like 1/3 of our neural development happens in the womb, and then 2/3 of our neural development happens in the first 3 years of our development. It's something along those lines. So in those first 3 years, including that section in the womb, we see so much of our neural development, even if we don't have a memory for it, but we can still have a lot of thoughts and beliefs structured around these events.
That is such a powerful story, and thank you for sharing that, because we think of, they say the issues are in the tissues, and right, and we may not remember a lot of these things. And you said you were training to become a somatic therapist, and I've done a lot of different somatic therapy to get rid of some things that were in my past, and it was helpful to some degree. Psychedelics were way more powerful. Ibogaine, by, like, oh my gosh, that was the number one crazy. Aside from giving birth, doing Ibogaine at just one time, it was the most transformational thing in my life, to heal these old traumas. And but this is something that we think about, like, in your book, you were talking about, and you mentioned at the beginning of the interview about the money issues as a young child, when you see your parents get a divorce, and then, so you start to make money stories up in your head, that money's bad. Mom has to go leave and work. She's not here for my soccer game, or whatever it might be. I had that similar experience, and it was just, as a kid, you don't feel worthy. You don't feel like, well, why are they doing that instead of being here with me? And it's very, very compounding. And sometimes it takes just one incident as a little child that you may not even remember, that, like, you wanted to get, a cookie, and mom didn't have enough money for the cookie. And so there's things that can get trapped in us, and then all of a sudden it sprouts your whole narrative as you keep moving through life subconsciously, and you may not even know that it's driving the bus of your decisions and how you're operating and how you're showing up as an individual. Have you had any aha moments like that on your journey, that you found something that was repressed or kind of operating underneath the surface?
Absolutely. That in one of the final chapters of the book, I kind of mentioned this very brief little story, which is, when I was about 8 or 9 years old, we went down to the toy store, and I remember there was a scooter that I wanted so badly. I thought it was just so amazing. And so I was like, you know what? I'm going to save. I'm going to save for the scooter. So I saved for about 3 or 4 months, saved all my pocket money, did a whole heap of extra chores. And I went down to the same toy store with my dad and my 2 brothers. And my dad, when we went up to the till to go pay, was just like, I feel bad that you're getting the scooter and your 2 brothers aren't. So I'm going to buy them a scooter. And I ended up having to pay for mine out of my savings. And they just got one. And what's interesting is, on a monetary level, there's something in economics called the Cantillon effect, which is those closest to the monetary spigot or the money printer benefit disproportionately. And this is kind of on a microcosm within our family unit. This is the Cantillon effect. It's those closest to my dad benefited disproportionately. But from that one experience, I realize now, looking back on it, that that's really what triggered this desire to be like, man, the world feels unfair. Like,
Yeah.
why does the system feel unfair? Why are certain people benefiting disproportionately? And what I think is amazing is that when we think about Bitcoin, and I'm trying to remember the guy's name. I can never remember his name for some reason. Anyway, he's the CEO of Stone Ridge Asset Management. And in his 2020 shareholder letter, he said, Bitcoin is a
Is that Ross
system.
Stevens?
Ross Stevens.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ross Stevens. And he says, Bitcoin is a system built upon rules instead of rulers. And all of a sudden it clicked. I was like, oh my God, that's exactly what it is. Like, our current system is built upon rulers that unfortunately people are self-interested. That's how the world goes round. And self-interested is an amazing thing, because when we're motivated by something, we want to try and direct our energy towards something to create something. Everybody benefits. But when you have a system which is centralized, that self-interest can lead us astray. And so that's where, although I very much support the free market, because I think we all benefit from any collaborative endeavors in the free market, when we have a system that is governed by a select few individuals that impacts all of us, that's when I disagree with self-interest. And so that's where I think we need a system that is built upon rules. So instead of having a system that benefits certain individuals, we have equality of opportunity. We all have the same opportunity, and then it's built upon meritocracy. The value we add to society benefits us all.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's an interesting thing. It's like, if we can all show up to the game with the same opportunity to play, but if you're showing up to a game where this guy over here, the bank, has the ability to just keep throwing, pieces of paper into the game and outbidding you on everything, and then you have to hustle and do these other things that you wouldn't typically do, I think we would see a lot less crime. I think we would see a lot less greed. I don't know. In my mind, really, I want to believe that us as humans, we have the ability to evolve if we have these basic, and you were talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If we have these basic needs met, and we have security met, and we have food met, can we get to a place of higher consciousness? And because, like, you look at what's going on, obviously, in all these different locations around the world, with these wars, with violence, with oppression, with government takeovers, people are exhausted. They're mad. They're angry. How can we help, rulers, these authoritarian leaders and these dictators, get out of that place? Like, is there a possibility that this is ever going to happen? And can Bitcoin be a tool to solve for that?
Well, and it's really interesting you mentioned that, because when you actually look at a lot of these dictators, a lot of these people that are willing to exert a lot of control over others, and then you just look at their childhood, you start to realize that most British politicians, they've been like in boarding schools. Their parents have effectively abandoned them to a school system, and they don't have that same ability to individuate. And so many times these authoritarian leaders are simply reenacting their own traumas on a global population, and they don't even know it. And that's where I think that, first off, if we have a monetary system that supports the individual, we've got reduced probability of people actually trying to exert control over others, because maybe we have less trauma in society. But second off, the monetary system massively impedes it anyway, regardless of whether or not someone wants to take control. And so what I think is so fascinating is that every other asset in history has either been physical in nature. So we've got property, you've got gold, you've got minerals. They're all physical in nature, which means they can be seized and taken by force. Or they're digital in nature. So you've got stock certificates, you've got bonds, you've got most of these other digital assets, and they're held by third parties, which means, again, if the government wants to come down heavy, they can still seize them by force, which basically means that any government, if they desire, can rule by force. Now, Bitcoin, because we can take self-custody of it, it's the first time ever in history that we can remember 12 to 24 words in our head, and we can store capital ourselves, which makes it almost impossible to take by force or seize. And all of a sudden, it flips the incentive. If the only way that someone can obtain Bitcoin is by you voluntarily handing it over to them because they offer value, well, all of a sudden the government has to start listening to its populace. It has to start responding in a way that meets the needs of its populace. And so it flips the incentives. Whereas in a fiat world, a government can simply print money and run a money printer and run deficits at the expense of the populace. On a Bitcoin standard, if people do not agree with what the government's doing and they refuse to pay taxes, refuse to pay whatever service fee, all of a sudden that government is going to go under because it cannot service its needs, and another one is going to rise up. And so what it does is Bitcoin forces a free market. It's a forcing function. It forces a free market for governments to compete against one another and offer value. And I think that is what is truly profound. And not only that, but because we can store 12 to 24 words in our head, if we do not agree with what our government is doing, we can walk across a border stark naked and we can store all of our value with us. And so now capital starts flowing to where value is being created in society. And we're seeing this happening in real time. People are moving to El Salvador. People are moving to jurisdictions that are favorable on Bitcoin. And increasingly, I think we'll see that happen, whereby eventually the countries that are not changing, the countries that are massively degrading society, eventually they're just going to lose all of their smart minds, all of their capital is going to flee. And so again, I think Bitcoin flips the incentives. It's a forcing function for value creation.
I think it's so powerful that, we get clear on understanding that. I just looked at, like, yesterday, didn't Canada just raise capital gains from 50% to 66.7, I think, or 67. So I'm a business person. I would never do business in a jurisdiction that would do that to me. What incentive do I have to stay in that area and produce value if I only get a fraction, like literally a small fraction of what I'm producing? And so that seems crazy to me, and I know a lot of folks from Canada who are just like, peace out. I don't want to be here after COVID and everything, and what was going on with the truckers and whatnot. A lot of people listening may not even know what happened with truckers, during the protest in Canada. And I feel like we need to take it more seriously, like what's going on with our money, because we are about to be we're on the verge of CBDC, central bank digital currencies, for those people who don't know what that is. And so surveillance tokens, basically surveillance money that can get shut down or get directed that you can only buy this or that with, or, oh, you made a post about this, we don't like it, or you donated to the truckers, we're going to shut down your CBDC. So the central banks are trying to do that all over the world, it seems like, and Bitcoin is a way out to not have to comply and have our behavior modified through our financial means. I mean, people who are saving their whole lives, all of a sudden, if they told you, well, no steak for you or no driving for you, you're exceeding your carbon limit for the week, or whatever's going on that the governments are going to start trying to use as excuses to control us financially. And so, for those listening who might, again, be a little intimidated by Bitcoin or digital currencies, can you help them get a sense of, is it that difficult to use Bitcoin, other than you're saying 12 and 24 words that we can remember? If you can remember the alphabet and sing it, you can remember your seed phrase, is what I like to tell people.
No, and I think, stepping back for 1 second before I dive into that, which is the fact that what people, and if we don't study history, we don't necessarily recognize where we're heading right now. And there's a phenomenal doctor of psychology at Ghent University in Belgium, and he wrote a book called The Psychology of Totalitarianism. And his name's Matthias Desmet. He's like the foremost expert in totalitarianism. And he, throughout all of his research over the years, looking all the way back throughout history at all of these totalitarian regimes, where we're looking at Mao Zedong, we're looking at Stalin, we're looking at Hitler, what he started to realize is there's 4 stages to these regimes. And the first stage is widespread meaninglessness. And when people have meaninglessness in society, they don't know how to contribute. Well, they get frustrated. And that leads to this next stage. If they're getting meaninglessness because they're working endlessly, well, then all of a sudden loneliness starts to set in. And if they're getting loneliness because they're not able to spend time with their peers, they're just having to work endlessly, well, then there's free floating anxiety, the third stage. Free floating anxiety meaning people don't know why they're feeling anxious. They can't attach it to anything. It's not like a fear of heights. I'm standing on the edge of a cliff. That is That's anxiety. It's because I know why I'm anxious. Free floating, we have no idea. And then that finally leads to frustration and aggression. And when all of these four things are met, these four stages, it's very easy for a controlling individual to spread a narrative, regardless of that truth, that if this narrative explains why they're feeling anxious, why they're feeling frustrated, then you get this mob mentality, which we saw during the pandemic. And
Mhm.
you can get these controlling structures arise very quickly where they impede upon people's rights and freedoms. Now, what's interesting, and I explain this in the book, is that I feel like he's missing one stage. And that one stage is stage zero, which is a broken monetary system. When you have a sound monetary system where people can express themselves monetarily, it's much harder for meaninglessness to kick in, for loneliness to kick in, free floating anxiety. And so I
Mhm.
believe that at the forefront of this is we need a sound monetary system. But central bank digital currencies, to your point, and a lot of the measures we're seeing taking place today, the trucker rally, you name it, increase in taxation, increase in capital gains taxes, what we're seeing increasingly is a slow infringement on our rights and freedoms. And
Yeah.
it's because our societies have borrowed beyond their means, they've borrowed from the future, and now they're struggling to service their debt payments. And if they're struggling to service their debt payments, well, if they fail to, the system collapses. So what do? They've got to do anything they can to stop the system from failing. So they increasingly need to infringe upon our ability to show up, our ability to save, to increase taxes. And this infringement is slowly breaking down society as it is. So I think what's so important for us to recognize is, why are we seeing central bank digital currencies come in? It's not because, oh, we want a nice ease of use currency that we can go tap our hand on a friggin' debit card, credit card machine, and we don't have to bring our card with us. It's got nothing to do with that. Instead, it's a way to be able to control society when people don't agree with what society, what the government and those in positions of power are doing. Well, it
Yeah.
allows the government to be able to silence those individuals and impede them from being able to show up as they want to be able to show up. And so where Bitcoin is different is that Bitcoin, for the first time in history, we have a trustless and permissionless system. And so what does that mean? Well, it means that we don't have to trust anyone. We don't have to rely on middlemen to be able to hold our capital. And on top of that, it's a permissionless system. We don't need permission to be able to spend our Bitcoin, which means capital flows to where value is being created. And that is huge. That is absolutely, we've never had a system like this ever in history. Gold wasn't even like this. And so, what is so cool about Bitcoin is that for the first time in history, we can direct capital where we see fit. And back to my point about monetary expression, we can express ourselves how we want to express ourselves. We're not dealing with a central bank digital currency, which, if I say something the government doesn't like, then all of a sudden I can be impeded in my ability to spend my capital. And if we think that seems very dystopian, the reality is that it's already happening. In
Yeah.
China, you can be impacted from taking on loans, buying a house, even putting your kids in certain schools, being able to live in certain areas just because your social credit score isn't up to a certain par. And so
Right.
it's scary. It's scary that we're seeing this happening right now. And I think it's important for people to understand that there's an underlying motive behind this. It's not all about ease of use. And what I do think is phenomenal is that Bitcoin, given that it is open source, anyone can work on Bitcoin, is that although Bitcoin, yes, in the past has been very technical and has been hard to interact with, it's getting easier and easier and easier. And as more people come on board, as we get more incredible minds jumping on board, it's becoming almost just as easy. And in time, it will overtake the ease of use of traditional centralized systems.
Yeah, I think so too. And I just coming back to the social credit score with the CBDCs and what's going on over in China, like a couple other just points that people should understand. Like if you're tied, with the social credit score, and if your uncle over here 3 steps away is doing something that the government doesn't like it's upon you because you have a couple steps of relationship to try to help change that person's behavior. Otherwise, even though you're not doing that other person's behavior, you could have also implications of getting your bank account or your CBDCs shut down. You can't take the bus. You can't do certain things that you can't go buy certain things. So it's all about behavior control. And when there's social pressure to do that, it's terrifying. And you think you have to comply because it's like, well, hey, Uncle Bob, you better get it together over there because I can't buy milk now for my baby or whatever might be going on. And so I just think of all the scenarios that could continue to play out if we allow this surveillance mechanism to overtake our the next generation of money instead of allowing Bitcoin and pushing our energy toward Bitcoin as a freedom tool, and as a peaceful money. I say peaceful money, peaceful world. If we don't have, like, fiat is not a peaceful money. It is a violent money. It is a extractive form of money. And Bitcoin, I think, is the ultimate peaceful money that we've ever seen. I haven't seen anything else more peaceful than Bitcoin. Have you?
No, no. And the other thing that I think is I always try to keep in the back of my mind is that ultimately it's actually not about Bitcoin. It is about the characteristics which Bitcoin instills that allow us to show up and
Yeah.
allow us to look intentionally at how we're showing up and ask those deep questions. And so that's what I think is so incredible about Bitcoin, is that it's actually not about Bitcoin.
Yeah, it's really about making the world a better place. And
Yeah.
money is just, it is the one thing that everybody has to use on planet Earth. We breathe oxygen, and we need money. Like, there's nobody that's really immune. Maybe somebody who lives in a cave all alone, a monk, but that's pretty rare, and God bless them, but for the most of us, we're united by money, and so why not have a money that unifies our hearts and our minds and can point us in a direction towards a higher value society and higher morals society, and thinking in terms of collaboration instead of competition. And I think that's such an important, message, because, I've been, I was a DJ a lot, I still DJ once in a while for fun, but that was my, my full-time past life. And it's very, very competitive, and it's kind of, it's not as collaborative as, some people might think. It is in some ways, but in some other ways it's elbows out, right? Um, with Bitcoin, what's been we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I want to talk about what you want to talk about, but what have you seen in your educational journey here as a Bitcoin educator with Looking Glass? How are you seeing people show up from a collaborative versus a competitive nature in organizations?
Oh man, honestly, I don't know anyone who's dedicated their life to supporting the US dollar or the Canadian dollar or the British pound, and all they want to do is freaking shout from the rooftops and quit their job to support the US dollar. And
Yeah.
when I think about Bitcoin, it never ceases to amaze me, this community. There are friggin' thousands, if not millions, of Bitcoiners all over the world who are dropping everything just to be able to go and spread the word and try and bring Bitcoin into their communities and to educate and share their points of view. And so, and actually in Madeira on my main stage talk, I mentioned this, but I think it's really, really important, is that we all speak to a unique cohort of individuals. I'm a mountain bike instructor. I have a unique cohort of individuals I speak to. You are a
Yeah.
DJ. I know doctors. I know lawyers. I know economists who all speak to their unique cohort of individuals. And if you're
Mm-hmm.
passionate about Bitcoin, there's no better time than now to be able to share your view on Bitcoin and how Bitcoin has impacted you, because you're going to help support people in their learning journey. And that's what I just really think is just so freaking incredible about this community, is Bitcoin ultimately, when we think about money, we think about this thing we transact with. But the reality is that money touches every single aspect of our lives, our
Yeah.
government, our politics, our environment, our relationships, our parents, all of these things. And so no matter who you are, no matter what background you come from, Bitcoin plays a role in your life. And if you're a Bitcoiner, you realize that. And so I think it's so important to share that.
It is. It's exciting. I know I've never seen a more generous and thoughtful and intelligent and heart-led community than Bitcoiners in my life. And
Mhm,
I'm a
mhm.
burner, and I love burners. They're the best too, and it's just it's remarkable. And every day, like, I jump out of bed and I'm like, oh my gosh, I get to be a part of this. I hope I'm doing a good job. I hope I can be in service and do the best that I can. And I think that's something that Greg Foss said on stage a couple years, like 2 years ago at the Miami conference. And he was just like, use your voice. Everybody has got something to contribute to Bitcoin. You don't have to be a hedge fund manager. You don't have to be a cryptographer. Like, we all have a voice. And imagine if we just, gave one person like the orange pill, and then that person had 10,000 people in there, so it's like, you don't have to do 10,000 people, but maybe that one person that you open their hearts and eyes to what Bitcoin can do for the future, then they domino their audiences, and so it's like every person matters, and every conversation, could lead to some kind of a new opportunity that we don't even understand the implications down the road. So I just invite all of us to, like, don't be shy, use your voice, and keep rocking forward. Any final thoughts? What's going on in the horizon for you? What are you looking forward to? Uh,
Well,
Obviously, the halving, of course. Let's see what happens here. But what's going on for you with projects that
you
people
know
can
what?
follow?
I'm reading a book right now called The Anatomy of the Spirit, and one of the things that really, really stood out to me is it
Carolyn
says,
Miss.
also, say it again.
Is it Carolyn Miss? My
Who? Oh
MYSS?
man, I can't remember the lady's name. I'll let
It's
you
her.
know.
I think
But
it's her. Yeah,
it's
yeah.
it is fascinating. And one of the things it said very early on in the book was um, every single every single thought, every single thing we do, every single interaction, every single behavior leaves an imprint on our soul, on our kind of like energetic level.
Yeah.
And it's very much going back to that point about how when we're even just holding and carrying a child, not we women, when women are holding and carrying a child, even just those little interactions, that stress can impact the development of that child. And what I think is so challenging about money today is that it's leaving this very heavy negative imprint. It's incentivizing certain behavior. We're constantly stressed about money. And Bitcoin, for the first time in my life, I feel hope. I feel the future is rosy, and it's changing my own thought process. It's changing my behavior. And that's what I just think is so freaking profound. And I think it's amazing.
I love it. I know it's a good mental health pill and a spiritual health pill. I think that we wouldn't understand that it how could money be making me feel better inside and
Mhm.
out, and but it does. But it's sound
Absolutely.
money. It's not just money. It's sound money. It's
Yeah.
peaceful money. And so okay, so everybody can find you at Seb Bunney Bunney on X or sebbunny.com. I'm going to put everything in the show notes, you guys, so you can check out Seb and all of his great work. And of course, Looking Glass Education. You guys are rocking it over there. Yeah. So, one last word from you. What's an inspirational thought that you would love to share with the folks listening who might be nervous to get into Bitcoin?
Oh, honestly, Bitcoin. I looked at Bitcoin for quite a few years from the sidelines, and it wasn't
Mm-hmm.
until I really dove in and actually just started to share my voice that I really just I kind of was completely engulfed by the community. And so I urge anyone who's listening to this, who's maybe shy or isn't necessarily interacting in the community, just to step outside and push yourself outside of your comfort zone, because people are always keen to help out and support you in your journey. And again, Valerie, I can't thank you enough for having me on. I think your energy is phenomenal, and I really enjoy all of our conversations.
Thanks, me too, Seb. And yeah, I echo what you say. It's like everybody that I've ran into in this community, they're so excited to help and share and talk about Bitcoin. So don't be shy. There's no dumb questions in Bitcoin. And there's no dumb questions anyway, but I think it's great. So thanks again, Seb. And you guys really have to get Hidden Cost of Money. It is an amazing, amazing book. And I love that you don't even mention Bitcoin for, I don't even know when do you, it's just like you talk about all the things that are wrong and then how we can solve it.
Mhm.
It's such a great approachable book. So thanks for taking all that time to make it available to us. So
No sweat. Oh, and I should say as well, like if I never want education and price to be a barrier to education, and so if you can't afford the book, just fire me an email on Twitter or on my website, and I'll just send you the ebook for free.
oh my gosh, you're the best, Seb. Holy cow. All right, brother. I love you. And thanks again for all the work you're doing out there in the world. And I can't wait to see you in person at some point, somewhere here at a conference or maybe a dance floor. Who knows? All right, brother. Thanks everybody for tuning in. This is DJ Val, and I hope you guys have the best day ever. And thanks again, Seb Bunny. You are the best.
Thanks,
Mwah.
guys.